Good evening, everyone. If you'd like to follow along tonight, we're picking back up in Psalm 78. Psalm 78. This is a rather long psalm, so we've been in this one for a little while now. But so far, what we have seen in this psalm is that it is a psalm of instruction. And as the psalmist has been writing this, he has basically been explaining that in order to be obedient to God's word, it's important to remember the lessons that have been taught in Scripture, to remember the ways that God has provided, to remember God's power, His wondrous works, His good deeds, and forgetting those things often coincides with falling away. And so he is explaining the need for this and how it benefits to teach it to future generations, just as they learned it from past generations. After he explains the purpose of the psalm, he got into some of the history lessons there, and he started to talk about the Exodus from Egypt, talk about some time in the wilderness, and where we left off was how neither rewards nor punishments seemed to have an impact on that particular generation. They continued to sin. Despite God's blessings, despite God's rebukes, they continued to sin. And so it brought us to their ultimate fate. We left off at verse 33, and it says, speaking of this generation, he said, "So he," meaning God, "brought their days to an end in futility, and their years to an end in sudden terror." So we see that this unbelieving generation here dies in the wilderness. And so you can read about that in Numbers chapter 14. Now we started to touch on this a little bit at the end of class last week, but why does it say that God consumed their days in futility? Rick?
They were just wandering around, just waiting to die. There was no purpose to that. And
Yeah.
if they'd been faithful, that would have never happened. You know?
Right, yeah. If they had been faithful, they would have made it to the promised land. God would have continued to guide them as he led them out of Egypt, and they would have made it to this promised land. Instead, they just wandered. They wandered around until they died, right? It was futile. Yeah?
Now that I think about it, that's a perfect parallel. If you don't have God in your life, you're just wandering around futilely.
Right.
And you die, right?
Right, exactly. It's sad is what it is, right? And that they were so close. They were so close to the promised land, and they could have been there. That's important to note. They could have been there. But what kept them out? It was their own unbelief and their own fear. Those things were the things that got in their way and prevented them from reaching the promised land. And again, we can so often see this journey of Israel and apply it to our own lives, anyone's life, right? God can lead you out of bondage of sin and deliver you into the promised land, but there's a journey of trust that's involved. And that's the portion that we're going through now, right? We accept Christ into our lives, we're baptized with him, and we have this journey of trust that we need to go on. And if we're faithful through that journey, and we believe in God and we trust in him, then we reach that promised land. But if you don't, you're just going to wander in futility, right? And so that's what happened here to this generation. Verse 34 says, "When he killed them, then they sought him, and they returned and searched diligently for God. And they remembered that God was their rock, and that the Most High was their Redeemer." We'll stop there for a second. So what's it mean when it says in verse 34, when he killed them, then they sought him? How do dead people seek him? Is that what it means?
I think it means spiritually dead.
Spiritually dead? Matt?
Or when he killed some of them because they had tried to go into the land. So they were as a group punished.
Right, when he killed some of them. Donna, I think you had your hand up?
I was just gonna say it was the remnants of the people that were still living.
The remnants of the people? Yeah, Rick?
I was just thinking as they died. I mean, the fact that they have to wander out there till they die just as they died, this punishment would drive some of them
Yeah.
to, of course, seek God and repent.
Right.
So,
Yeah, so when this unbelieving generation died, it wasn't that was the end of Israel, right? There were still more Israelites. It was the following, the younger generation that was still remained. So when the unbelieving older generation died, the rest of Israel, that's the they that's left. Then they sought him, and they returned and searched diligently for God, and they remembered that God was their rock and and the Most High God, their Redeemer. So that's promising, right? That sounds good. It sounds like some of Israel's finally sinking in some, right? They saw this example. But what did they do wrong? If you read ahead a little bit, what did they do wrong?
I read ahead a little bit.
You read ahead a little bit? Yeah. Verse 36 and 37, it says, "But they flattered him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue, for their heart was not steadfast towards him, nor were they faithful with his covenant." Okay, so what's their issue? Sum that up. What does that mean? What was their problem? Rick?
lip service, basically. They
Lip
would say
service.
they would say they're following God or doing what He wants, but then again, their actions would not back that up at all.
Right.
That kind of thing.
So we have the older generation that's just flat out rebellious. Everything that God does, they take issue with, right? He drags them out of Egypt. Oh, you made us leave such a great place in slavery, right? He gives them manna from heaven. I don't really like this. He gives, and it just kept going that way. Whatever it was, they were unhappy with. Now, this one is at least acting like they care about God and seeking Him out, so that we have a little bit of a start, right? Because they are given some credit here. In verses 34 and 35, it says they returned and searched diligently for God. So Asaph gives them credit. They did do something. They did turn and look to God and remember God, but it seems somewhat insincere, right? It's just lip service. They're flattering Him, and it says their heart was not steadfast. Their heart is not steadfast, okay? So it's not outright rebellion like the previous generation, but this isn't great either, right? Because if your heart's not steadfast, then what's that mean?
Tossed to and fro.
You're tossed to and fro, right? Do we remember the story about like building your house on the rock or on the sand, or maybe you're thinking of the Bible song in your head, right? That's the kind of thing that this is. Not being steadfast meant that sometimes they were obedient and sometimes they did some good things, but it wasn't a concrete thing. They were wishy-washy, right? But notice what it says in verse 38. But He, being compassionate, forgave their wrongdoing and did not destroy them. And He often restrained His anger and did not stir up all His wrath. So He remembered that they were only flesh, a wind that passes and does not return. So here's a great example of where we see God's compassion. Again, and as I like to point out, this is in the Old Testament, right? This is where a lot of people think that God is just throwing lightning bolts at everyone who moves, right? But that's not what's happening. God is showing compassion despite these people being insincere, despite these people not sticking with things. It says He forgives their wrongdoing and does not destroy them. Okay? So why? It says here, there's a specific reason why God does not stir up all His wrath. Why does He do that?
You remember, they're just human. They were flesh.
They're just human.
Yeah.
They're just flesh.
Yeah. They
Yeah.
didn't have the willpower of what it took to be the...
Yeah. Matt?
He was compassionate in verse 38.
Yeah, He's compassionate. He's remembering their nature. Rick, you had your hand up too?
Oh, yeah, and that, to go along with what Eddie's saying, they were a breath that passes away and does not come again.
Yeah, they're a breath that passes away. And the word there in Hebrew is ruach, right? So that means spirit, wind. That's often used when talking about it. So there's something that passes away quickly, right? And so God is remembering their nature. Now, obviously, God being the creator doesn't need to be reminded of what he was created, right? This is where describing God's character can be hard with the English language, right? And we use the words that we have. This is God being compassionate for us because of our own shortcomings, right? So we see God's compassionate nature and his forgiving nature here. Now, verse 40 and 41, it says, "How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. Again and again they tempted God and pained the Holy One of Israel." So here, to me, it almost sounds like Asaph is lamenting his own people's unbelief here, right? He's recognizing, as he's going through, remember, he listed out some of the things that he wants to call your attention to. God's power, God's works, especially God's deeds towards Israel. And so he's drawing that out, and it's almost like, on the other hand, he's also lamenting that his people just keep falling short of that, right? They just keep falling short. And if you think about the covenant, the Old Testament, what did the Old Testament hinge on? What did the Old Covenant hinge on versus the New Testament?
The Ten Commandments?
I'm thinking more along the lines of the previous covenant was showing that it can't be based on mankind's faithfulness, because mankind can't hold that up. It's God's faithfulness that pulls things together, right? So when you think about the New Testament, it's not reliant on mankind's faith, right? And we see that's part of the reason that we had those two testaments, right? The Old Testament and the New Testament, is to illustrate that if we were to try and meet God's standards all on our own, that's impossible. We're just not going to make it, which is why we need the New Testament. We need the blood of Christ. We need him as our mediator, because we can't do it on our own. Man is just not able to do that because we are only flesh, right? Any other thoughts there? Okay. So again, he's lamenting his people. He says that they rebelled against God. They grieved him. They tempted him, or your version says tested him. It says that they pained the Holy One, right? Now, we like to talk about, humans can be self-centered, right? And everything we talk about is about us. But notice what we, humans, do against God here, right? They rebelled against God. They grieved him. They tempted him. They pained him, right? And now that's I know in this specific instance we're talking about Israel, but really this is all mankind that does this, you know? And this kind of just shows humans aren't really as great as we like to prop ourselves up to be, you know? So we can see here how this is kind of from God's side of things, that we cause a lot of pain and a lot of grief. And so Asaph here, he's lamenting that. He goes on in verse 42 and verse 43, he says, "They did not remember his power, the day when he redeemed them from the enemy, when he performed his signs in Egypt and his marvels in the field of Zoan." So again, they did not remember, right? And one of the reasons that Asaph is talking about this is because he wants them to remember, because remembrance is important. Remembrance helps with obedience. And so he mentions an event here. What events does he recount?
Doing the signs there in Egypt. You know?
Right, the signs in Egypt.
Signs, what were there? There was like 10 signs, really. All the, I can't remember them all right. All
Yeah.
those different signs.
Yeah, exactly. The plagues in Egypt, right? Now, what were they? I won't ask Rick because he just said he doesn't remember, right? We'll let him off the hook.
You want all 10 plagues?
Some
If you know them.
Some of them are right here.
Yeah, some of them are right there. Does anybody have them memorized off the top of their head? It's okay if you don't. I have to look it up too. Asaph does mention a few, as Matt said. He calls out some specific ones here in verses 44 down to 48. He says, "And turned their rivers to blood, and their streams so that they couldn't drink. He sent swarms of flies among them that devoured them, and frogs that destroyed them. He also gave their crops to the grasshopper, and the product of their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hailstones, and their sycamore trees with frost. He also turned their cattle over to the hailstones, and their herds to bolts of lightning." We'll stop there. I know he keeps on going, but we'll just pause for a moment. These are just some of the ones we mentioned there. And again, it's all those, and he does conclude in verse 49 talking about a band of destroying angels. So one neat thing, and I'm sure this is not new to you, but these plagues, not only did they serve the purpose there that God had, but they also showed God's superiority over the supposed Egyptian gods. Because many of these showed God's control and God's authority over an area that an Egyptian god supposedly ruled, right? I know that this is small because I was trying to squeeze a lot on here, but rivers to blood. So there were 3 Egyptian gods that kind of had to do with the Nile, and I'm not good at pronouncing them, so I'm not going to really try, but there are these 3 that had to do with that. Then for the swarms of flies, there was one that had to do with that, the frogs, the crops, the sky, for the hail, frost, lightning, there was a sky goddess. There was a goddess that was kind of watching over cows, so that was the cattle dying to the hail. So it showed God's superiority over all of these supposed Egyptian gods. And then, of course, the worst of all of these comes in verse 49 here. It says, "He sent his burning anger upon them, fury and indignation and trouble, and a band of destroying angels." So in the New American Standard Bible, it says a band of destroying angels. The King James says evil angels. And in the New King James Version, it says angels of destruction. So I think depending on how you look at this could mean different things. So what do you think it means? Matt?
Well, that whole destruction, evil, bad is just a simple word for bad. So it's like
Right.
they did bad things to people, like the
Right.
death or whatever.
Yeah. Most people will interpret this one of 2 ways, right? The first is what Matt is saying, right? These are good angels, but they are carrying out a punishment. They are bringing a bad thing. This is what they are meant to do. So here, a band of destroying angels. These angels are sent to destroy something. Rachel?
And according to Revelation, it's these same types of angels that are going to pour out his wrath on the earth.
Right, exactly. Same thing that we see in Revelation, right? Angels of destruction doing that. Now, the one that I think sometimes can lead to a different interpretation is the King James Version, where it says evil angels, which I think sometimes people have interpreted as, the angels that fell and followed Satan, essentially demons, right? That God essentially took away the protective hedges and allowed angels to destroy Egypt, or evil angels, wicked angels, right? So those are 2 possibilities that I often run into. What I will say is that the way that the word evil is used in the King James Version is not quite the way that we use it today, right? So it's like Matt said, these angels bring a bad thing. It's not that they are themselves bad, but that they bring a bad thing upon them, right? It's similar to the way that the word evil is used when we talk about money the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not all evil, it's just like all kinds of trouble, right? So it has to do with the way that English is used back then versus now. I'm of the opinion that because we have the interpretations here, also when we look at Revelation, that this is really talking about angels that were sent to administer this punishment on God's behalf, on his will. He ordered this to happen. So I'll stop there for just a minute and see if there's any other comments or questions about that. Matt?
I think this came up before. I think Shirley brought up there was a passage we covered in the King James, and it said something about how, and the Lord did evil. And it was like, what?
Right.
You know, the Lord's not wicked. It's just the Lord brought some punishment on people, was what it was in that context. And I think this is the same idea.
Right, exactly. That's a great example. That's perfect. Yeah. Okay, so then verse 50. Verse 50 to 51. It says, he leveled a path for his anger. He did not spare their souls from death, but he turned their lives over to the plague, and struck all the firstborn in Egypt, the first and best of their vigor in the tents of Ham. So Pharaoh would not let God's firstborn, Israel, go. Israel was sometimes referred to in that manner. If you see Exodus chapter 4, there's one instance where Israel is called God's firstborn. So God takes the firstborn out of Egypt. So there's some poetic justice in terms of judgment there. And then verse 52, it says, but he led his own people out like sheep, and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them safely so that they did not fear, but the sea engulfed their enemies. So he brought them to his holy land, to this hill country which his right hand had gained. He also drove out the nations from them and apportioned them as an inheritance by measurement, and had tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. Okay? So, how does God help Israel after the plagues? Asap's kind of like recapping again here. He leads them like sheep, right? Guides them in the wilderness, led them safely, engulfed their enemies with the sea, brought them to his holy land, drove out the nations, gave them an inheritance. So God is very, very active in their deliverance here. Okay? Now, all of this, again, we're talking about the generation that finally makes it to the promised land. How does Israel respond to God's kindness after reaching Canaan?
They tested and provoked him.
Verse 56, yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimony. It says, but turned back and acted treacherously like their fathers. They turned aside like a treacherous bow, for they provoked him with their high places and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. So they tempt God, they test him, they rebel, they turn back. So this previous generation, this is kind of getting at their lack of being steadfast. They flip-flop and they go back like their fathers. They worship the Canaanite gods. At least the previous generation wasn't doing that, right? But they worship the Canaanite gods. And so what is the result then of this rebellion? We saw how it turned out for the previous generation. What's this rebellion? Verse 59. What happens?
He utterly rejects Israel.
He utterly rejects them, right? Utterly rejects them. And it says, so that he abandoned the dwelling place at Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among the people, and gave up his strength to captivity and his glory into the hand of the enemy. It mentions a specific event here. Something happened at Shiloh. What happened at Shiloh?
Isn't that was where during the time of was it the Judges or whatever, where they lost the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah, the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, right? That was him utterly rejecting him. Remember, they used to take that before them in battle. This was their confidence going into it. And it was captured there. And even the way it says it, he abandoned the dwelling place. Remember where God dwelt?
Mercy seat.
The mercy seat, right? Right above the Ark of the Covenant. He dwelt there. He abandoned this. And it says, and he gave up his strength to captivity. So he gave up Israel to captivity and his glory into the hand of the enemy. So the ark fell into the hands of the enemy. They actually got it. Now, of course, that's a fun story to see what happens once it gets to the Philistines. So if you don't remember that, I'd encourage you to go read it.
I just read that yesterday.
Did you? It's actually, it's almost comical in a way.
It was.
So Israel, but on Israel's end, they become captives and many die at the hands of the Philistines. So this is a very dark time for them. Now, let's see. We'll keep going here. Verse 62, he also turned his people over to the sword and was filled with wrath at his inheritance. So he was very angry with Israel. A lot of them died. It says, fire devoured his young men, and his virgins had no wedding songs. His priests fell by the sword, and his widows could not weep. So not a great time in Israel's history. But then in verse 65, I think, might be a little bit of a difficult verse to translate. Verse 65 in the New American Standard says, then the Lord awoke as if from sleep, like a warrior overcome by wine. Okay? And I'll read two other translations of that. The King James Version says, then the Lord awaked as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouteth by reason of wine. And New King James is almost just like it. It says, then the Lord awoke as from sleep, like a mighty man who shouts because of wine. So that might sound a little confusing. What is Asaph trying to say? What is the message here?
Well,
Matt?
Kind of like when the people were in captivity in Egypt, and then the Lord remembered his people, you know.
Right.
It's not that he forgot them, and it's not that he was asleep here.
Right.
But he's turned his attention and decided to then be forgiving and merciful.
Yeah. What I think is interesting is that he chooses this image of this man that, depending on which translation you're going from, it either sounds like this guy gets, you know, I might say liquid courage, right? Someone drinks and then goes charging into battle because of it, you know, or it's someone who drank so much that they're like almost passed out in a stupor, but then they like get up all of a sudden and they're raging around. It seems like such an odd example to apply here. You know, you would think that you would keep away anything like that from the image of God, but this is what he chooses, right? It reminds me almost like the what was it? I think it was the steward who was bad with money in the New Testament. It's such a strange example to use, but nonetheless, it's that God stirs himself suddenly. He was quiet for this long time, and finally he stirs himself to the people's issues. It wasn't that he forgot about them, but it is finally time that he comes to their rescue. Donna?
I think, to me, it sounds like the fog lifted, that God was in this place, and when he got over it, he got into action again.
Rick?
Maybe we should think of it as having like a spirit of renewal for a moment, you know, how
Yeah.
someone would be, like you said, liquid courage, but
Yeah.
it kind of renews or emboldens their spirit, so.
Right. Matt?
Well, it's just kind of like how the Lord's going to come like a thief in the night. You know, again,
Right.
we wouldn't impute the thievery idea. It's just that to our perception, just like how we wouldn't expect a thief to come at night and be surprised. He's just, we feel like he's forgotten us, but all of a sudden he's back and now he's saving us, and it's that surprise.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to remember that God has feelings. Sometimes it can be easy to forget that, but we are made in his image, right? We have feelings because God has feelings. And we see that reflected in his son as well, right? When Jesus comes down, we see that Jesus had feelings, right? He got upset about things. He got sad about things. He was happy and joyous about things. God is not emotionless, right? We can grieve him, right? We saw that earlier. We can pain him. We can make him angry, but he can also be compassionate to us. Donna?
Well, we learn right away in the book of Genesis that God had emotions because it pleased him with what he made.
Right, right. And I think that sometimes it's a thing that people just tend to forget, that God has feelings. And so we should be thoughtful of that and how our behavior impacts our Lord. We're out of time tonight. I actually ran a little bit over. We were so close to the end, I thought we'd make it, but we'll just have to finish that off next week. So, thank you, everyone.
Satan is a predator. This evening, I just want us to look at a couple of verses from 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. I know these are very well-known verses, but they tell us a lot about our enemy and how to defeat him or how we resist him. And these verses, to me, have always seemed key to defeating Satan in our lives. So 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." I just want us to look at this verse, just kind of pick it apart a little bit. There's a lot here about what we should do and about Satan or the devil. So first, we must be sober. And I know we talked about this the other day. This sober is not about not drinking alcohol, but it's about being clear-headed, thinking clearly. The idea is to not be deluded or deceived, but to stay calm and think clearly. Know what is true, see the truth, and do not be fooled. Especially concerning our enemy, knowing what he is and what he is doing, and what his goal is for that matter. Then Peter says, be vigilant, be on guard, stay alert, be wary. Watch out, do not get complacent in this world, stay focused and watchful, do not be lulled into a false sense of security, do not go to sleep. And we're talking about spiritually, it's okay to sleep. Physically, that's normal. But spiritually, stay awake and be on guard. Danger is all around us in this world, especially spiritually. Now, then we get to the why. Because your adversary, because of our adversary, right? So an adversary is an enemy. It's someone who is against us, and our enemy is actively hostile to us. He is our foe, and he wants to kill us. And that is our enemy, Satan. Sometimes he'll try to deceive people into believing that he's their friend, or that he's some sympathetic character, but he's not. He's our foe, and he's trying to destroy us. For us as children of God, we are sheep in the Lord's church or in his flock. We're members of his body, but if you think of him as our wonderful shepherd, then we are his sheep. We are his flock. And Satan is walking around this flock like a roaring lion, like a predator. In the scenario that Peter gives us here, it tells us some things about him. Like what I was saying, he walks about, or he conducts his life. The Greek word would mean he walks like, or he conducts his life like this, like a roaring lion, like he's a fearsome predator. And the idea of the roaring is to make us afraid, to intimidate us, maybe to scare us into making a wrong choice, or to flee when we should stand. But Satan is a predator. We don't want to forget that. He is circling the flock, just like earthly predators do. And if you think about earthly predators, when they're circling a herd or a flock, They're looking for the weak, the small, the sick, and those who wander off, and so that they're defenseless. That's just like what earthly predators do too. He does the same thing. They don't confront the strongest or chase the fastest or try to attack the herd all at once by themselves or something like that. So instead, they're looking for predators, and Satan being a predator, he is looking for, like I said, the weak. And that's what he's doing. He's seeking a victim, someone to devour. He's not doing it for nourishment. He's just doing it simply to kill and destroy because he hates us. We're God's, and his desire is to destroy us. So he is this predator seeking prey, and he prowls around God's people looking for those that he can destroy. The young, the weak, the small, the sick, those that stray. Those are the easy prey for him. But don't be afraid. Satan's power was broken by Jesus on the cross. He really has no power over us if we are in the faith and realize and know that he has already lost. He's seeking those he may devour, those that will allow him to consume them. If we're weak or straying, he will try to consume our lives with sin, with fear, with anger, with hate. He will try to consume our minds and hearts with worldly things if we allow him. But let's see what else the Lord tells us through Peter in verse 9 here. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. We're told to resist, oppose, withstand the devil. Resist the fear, the deception, the temptation, anything that would weaken our faith or maybe cause us to stray. And we should be solid in our faith, be hard as rock, stable and consistent in our trust in the Lord. If you think about where we're told that we're living stones, we're becoming or growing into living stones. We're built on the rock that is Jesus. And the idea is this does not give Satan a chance. We're supposed to grow into those living stones for a reason, so that we're firm in our faith and unbreakable in our trust of the Lord. That way we're not a weak and easy target. And Peter reminds us too here that we are not alone. All of us are together. And Jesus is our shepherd that protects us. We stay together. We stay with him. We don't wander and stray off. And we actually reach out to the straying. And we gather around the weak and try to strengthen and protect them. So in closing, I just want us to remember these things. We need to stay sober, stay alert, resist in faith, and help each other. Realize we're not alone. That's the point of our invitation this evening, that we're all in this fight together, and we should be helping keep each other from this predator. And if we can help you this evening in any way, if there's something we could do for you, pray for you, please come forward as we stand and sing.